Can the ACCC succeed in limiting Facebook and Google's power over the internet?
And who were the big winners in the ACMA's 5G auction?
Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined by a man whose telco ambitions were dashed when his 50-cent bid for 5G spectrum was rejected, Alex Kidman, as we go behind the headlines in search of the big picture.
One day, Adam, one day.
I'm sure Telstra's just quaking in its boots. We're also joined once again by longtime friend of the show and the queen of 5G, ZDNet Deputy Editor Corinne Reichert. Corinne, welcome back to the show.
Queen of 5G, I love it. It's great to be here again. Thank you.
This week, we're looking over a whole slew of ACCC investigations into Google and Facebook's power in Australia, as well as the outcome of the ACMA's 5G spectrum auctions. But first, over to the Vertical Hold news desk. Alex, what's new in tech?
Samsung has announced its latest smartphone, the Galaxy A8s, with triple rear cameras and an otherwise mid-range set of components. What really sets the A8s apart, and more than likely signals Samsung's design direction for 2019, is the use of a laser-cut hole for the front camera instead of a notched display. Samsung calls its take the Infinity O display, and it's expected that it'll use a similar design for the upcoming Samsung Galaxy S10.
Adelaide is set to boldly go where no Australian state capital has gone before, becoming the home of the new Australian Space Agency. The federal government is investing $41 million into the agency, aiming to triple the country's space economy to $12 billion and create up to 20,000 jobs by the year 2030. The agency is set to become the crown jewel of Adelaide's new Australian Space Innovation Precinct. A number of startups have already based themselves in Adelaide, including Fleet Space Technologies, which plans to launch 100 satellites.
The Assistance and Access Bill passed Parliament at the last minute late last week, or technically speaking, after the last minute, thanks to the Labor Party deciding to support the bare bones of the bill, subject to amendments it will table next year. Those amendments now look to be on shaky ground, however, with Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton indicating that the Liberal National Party government won't necessarily support all of Labor's amendments. Meanwhile, the bill has attracted significant scorn from industry heavyweights including Google, Apple, Facebook and Microsoft, all of whom call the bill deeply flawed in a joint statement.
Google has brought forward the date for killing off its struggling Google Plus social network after discovering yet another bug which exposed the data of more than 50 million users. Google says it has no evidence that the exposed data was misused, but the ailing social media service will now be put out of its misery in April 2019 rather than waiting until August. So, Alex, Samsung's moving in a new direction, drilling holes in the front of their cameras, the Infinity O. So what, I don't know if that means your phone will have an O face. What are we talking about here?
We're talking about phones with holes, which is just going to lead to the smuttiest of headlines. I already know one Australian tech journalist who's lining up her filthy headlines for next year because it's not just going to be Samsung that goes down this particular route. Because in 2018, what we saw were notches on phones here, there and everywhere. Some people loved them, some people hated them. I honestly didn't think they ruined the look of a phone, although I did favour those models that let you black out the sides so that it just appeared to be a top bezel. I've never been as fussed by bezels as other folks. Corinne, do you have a notch opinion? Will you be looking forward to having a phone with a hole in it?
I do have a notch opinion. I'm using the new Huawei Mate 20 Pro, and it does have a notch at the top, which doesn't bother me in terms of, aesthetics. But what bothers me is that there's no room for my icons up there. So it's always got the Wi-Fi one, the VoLTE one, the mobile one, and the Vibrate one, which means I don't get any icons for any of my actual notifications because the notch is in the way. So that's my issue with the notch, but I'm not sure what this laser cut hole will be.
No, so what you imagine, I mean, certainly for the A8s, it's a pretty easy thing to explain. Imagine just the camera hole, so just a tiny little circle more or less on the side of the screen. So instead of having, and I've got a Mate 20 Pro in front of me, it's a great phone at the moment. Instead of that, where you've got that really prominent notch, just imagine the camera hole itself being off to the side. The rest of the screen is available. So you would, in theory, get your notifications back. Now, that obviously depends on how Android treats those kinds of spaces. We've already seen in the Android underlying code that there's support for multiple notches. Holes are they're a little different, I think.
Are we talking about a hole in the screen itself?
We're talking about a camera display. You're not going to be able to hang your phone off your keyring if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, no. But what I mean is, it's like, you can have the fingerprint reader built into the screen. Will the camera then be behind the screen and there's a tiny hole letting the camera peek out from the screen? Is that what they mean by a hole? I'm still having trouble visualizing this.
Sort of. And look, I mean, where this technology is headed and where they've actually pushed a lot of patents already, but nobody's come up with one, is what you just alluded to with fingerprint sensors, which is this idea that eventually we might get to something where it can go, right, there's a camera here, but you can't really see it. It's just sitting behind there until you need it for a purpose. And obviously there are some pretty significant technical challenges before you can get to that space, especially if you want quick access. We saw Oppo do this with the Find X phone, that funny little pop-up mechanism. Neat idea. Implementation was a little bit kind of slow and clunky, and I do worry about getting dust and sand into that thing. But it looks like next year is going to be the year of the smartphone hole, because already Huawei appear to be going down that path. It looks like Oppo will as well. And the smartphone industry, when a new idea comes along, everyone tends to jump on it.
So, Alex, the ACCC's throwing their weight around again. They're not afraid to pick a fight with the big boys. What's going on this time?
Yeah, Mr. Sims is out there and he's throwing haymakers. He's really going in heavy.
Sims smash.
This week, one of the bigger bits of work that the ACCC has done, and it's actually done a lot in the tech space this week, is to release its preliminary report into the digital platforms inquiry. And this is looking into the relative dominance of the big industry players like Google and Facebook when it comes to media dissemination, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to news bubbles, when it comes to the overall media landscape, which is obviously of interest to all three of us here. It's a big, wide-ranging report with a whole bunch of potential recommendations, looking into whether or not they need more regulatory power around how transparent Google and Facebook are about things like advertising relationships, how privacy data is handled and reported and shown, even extending to things like the potential suggestion for tax deductibility for print newspapers to maintain their viability, or forcing Google to bundle alternate browsers with Android phones. It's a very, very long document, 340 odd pages. It's
are they just
essential nighttime reading, really.
Are they just throwing in ideas and they'll see what sticks and what they can get away with? That sounds a bit ambitious by anybody's standards.
Well, it is just their preliminary report. Their
preliminary. Here's all the stuff we sat down and brainstormed, and here's all the stuff we came up with that we thought we'd have a crack at, basically.
I think, to be fair to the ACCC, it's good that they're looking at the whole picture. It's just that the whole picture is substantially complex. Like, there's a lot of kind of balls to keep juggling in the air to tackle everything that a Google or a Facebook does. And I mean, and at the same time, they're also looking into whether or not some of the things that they're already doing might be contravening existing legislation. The ACCC is actually doing its job here, I think.
So, Corinne, out of all of this, what sort of jumps out as you as the most interesting? The thing you reckon maybe they've got the least chance or the most chance of actually
Google and
achieving?
Facebook do have a lot of market power, so it is good that the ACCC wants to make sure it's not misusing that. And also, most importantly for me, that they take responsibility for fake news being shared or linked on their platforms. There's so much out there and it has such an impact, on society in general and on elections. So I think it's good that they're sort of monitoring the distribution of news and journalistic content. I mean, there are 19 million users of Google, 17 million on Facebook. This is just in Australia, 11 million on Instagram. So there's a lot of people looking at this content every single day. So I think it's good that they want some more accountability over this.
Yeah, I find that I totally agree that fake news should not be promoted on these platforms. And I find it kind of interesting in that Facebook, for example, and I know, Adam, you've written about this quite a bit. Facebook is really good at kind of clamping down on people when it decides it doesn't like them. If you dare show anything that might look like nudity, they're all over you like a ton of bricks. But there's an awful lot of what is genuinely hate speech that just seems to sail right past them time after time after time. They don't seem fussed by that, though.
No, and one of the interesting things is when they introduce those rules, they leave no margin for, like, they won't even tell you which rule that you've broken, which maybe you think, oh, who cares? They were some racist turd who deserved to get in trouble. But sometimes it's someone who's done nothing wrong and just needs an opportunity to explain themselves. But, oh, no, not listening. Sorry, case closed. So they do need to sort of have a little bit more finesse maybe in the way they apply these things. But yeah, I hear a lot of talk about this stuff, and I'll be interested to see how much of it they can actually translate into action. And again, like the encryption stuff, are we really, when we're a small country like Australia trying to tell the world's tech giants how to do things, you got to wonder whether it's just easy for them to go, well, screw you guys, we're going home.
I did an interview actually earlier in the week on ABC Radio in Melbourne where they'd interviewed Rod Sims, the head of the ACCC, about this and a lot of the other stuff that the ACCC was doing. And that exact point came up of, how much leverage you've actually got over overseas companies. His position on that was that he was in discussion with similar regulatory bodies overseas who were all looking in the same kind of direction. I don't know if I'm entirely comfortable with the idea of saying, oh, well, these companies are too big, they're too global, we shouldn't regulate them, or we can't regulate them because we're just Australia.
The ACCC's got a lot of things going on at the moment, haven't they? They said they've got 5 things going on, I think, plus what they're doing looking into the telcos.
There have been a lot of announcements from the ACCC in the last month alone. I've written a lot about the ACCC.
They're trying to hit their annual KPIs or something?
Maybe they had a lot of things due by the end of 2018, and now they've realized it's December, so it's time to get a move on with them, because it's been ridiculous, the number of ACCC inquiries either kicked off or, a discussion paper or concluded. So there's been a lot from them.
And but there's a lot in the tech space as well. I mean, they're usually pretty busy, but, we've got NBN wholesale service standards. They're looking at copper declarations, which a lot of people might go, well, what? But for a percentage of the Australian population, they're going to be on copper phone lines at least for the next little while, and the pricing around that's kind of important. I'm left wondering if they're not doing that whole, hang on, we're about to go on holidays. Oh, God, there's all this work left over. Quick! Kind of call.
Yeah, and I mean, they're looking at NBN, rebates for delayed migrations or for problems connecting. They're looking at mobile termination access rates as well, peering inquiries, NBN wholesale service standards. So they're doing a lot of things at the moment. They just declared backhaul last week as well. So there's a lot happening in the tech space and the telco space.
So, Corinne, or should I say, Your Majesty, Queen of 5G, Corinne, it's been a big week for 5G with the ACMA, earning itself a lot of pocket money, hasn't it?
Yes, so the ACMA finally announced the results of its 5G spectrum auction. We've been waiting for a few weeks to see how it all went down in November. So in total, the ACMA made $853 million from the auction, which was 350 lots of 3.6 gigahertz spectrum across 14 areas of Australia. So Telstra predictably picked up the most. They spent $386 million for 143 lots. Then the TPG Vodafone joint bid paid $263 million for 131 lots. Optus paid $185 million for 47 lots, and a company no one had ever heard of before called Dense Air Australia paid $18.5 million for 29 lots. So I guess they were the surprise bidder in this auction, but it looks like they're eyeing 5G as well.
And this is for spectrum that, strictly speaking, they don't actually get to access until 2020, right?
Right. So the licenses commence in March 2020, but carriers can access it earlier, and a lot of them are planning on launching 5G next year in 2019. So as long as they come to an agreement with incumbent users, or incumbent users have already moved from the spectrum to a different band, they can actually access them next year. So we'll see a lot of 5G deployments across the 3.6.
Which bands are we talking about here? Because there was also the really much higher stuff that they're talking about as well.
Yes.
I can't remember what that's called.
Millimeter wave, yes.
Millimeter wave,
which is around the...
I knew it was there somewhere. Are we talking millimeter wave?
No, so this is 3.6. So this is mid-band spectrum. So the millimeter wave is high-band spectrum, sort of in the 28 gigahertz range. They haven't yet announced when they're going to put that to auction. Telstra told me, I think, earlier this month that it was supposed to come to auction in 2019, but they're more expecting 2020, which is quite a long time to wait, especially when a lot of other countries around the world have access to millimeter wave now. And I mean, millimeter wave is shorter range and it has line of sight issues in comparison to 3.6, but it's much higher speed, which is why telcos are building out a lot of small cells now so that they can get past those limitations of line of sight and short range, but still have, the really low latency and the really high speeds that everyone associates with 5G.
Just kind of speaking on that, there was a lot of talk from Telstra and even from Optus, even though they actually, picked up the fewest lots of the big three players, about their regional aspirations, which we haven't heard as much of. They've all largely been talking metro previously. Do you think just that use of 3.6 gigahertz, because it's got that potential longer range,
definitely
has a big part to play there?
You need to pair up the high range, short distance, high speed with the longer range, lower range spectrum to get a full 5G service. I mean, it can't be, a total 5G experience, I guess, unless you have all these different bands paired up together. And look, Telstra got a bunch of metro and regional 3.6, as did TPG/Vodafone. Optus was constrained to regional spectrum this time because it already holds a lot of spectrum in the 3.6 band in metro areas, and the government put in an allocation limit for those. So they weren't actually allowed to bid for a lot of that spectrum. And then Dense Air Australia bought spectrum across all the capital cities, but not the regional areas. So I think they all want to launch. And I mean, if you look at Telstra's early launches, a lot of those are actually in regional areas, Toowoomba for one, rather than, I mean, they haven't launched at all in Melbourne or Sydney yet, any of their 5G services. So they are all looking at regional areas, especially because 5G is going to bring about a lot of, the smart agriculture, smart logistics, transport use cases. So they definitely want to launch it across the entire nation and not just in capital cities.
Okay, 2 questions. I'll ask them both and we'll work through them. Firstly, what has the ACCC had to say about this love-in between Vodafone and TPG? And secondly, who the hell is Dense Air Australia? But I want to know about the ACCC stuff first.
Oh, but the Dense Air Australia stuff is so fun. I mean, I write about 5G and telcos every single day, and I'd never heard of Dense Air Australia until Monday when the ACMA announced this. And they're calling themselves an operating company under the Airspan Group that provides wholesale shared neutral host LTE 4G mobile network densification and extension services.
Bingo!
So from what
Tombola.
From what I gather, it helps telcos densify their networks by building and renting out small cells. And it's also been acquiring 2.6 gigahertz mobile spectrum across New Zealand. So they're looking to help telcos densify their networks in preparation for 5G, which, as I said earlier, needs a lot of small cells to get past the millimeter wave
so
limitations.
they're a 5G middleman then. Nice
Yes,
network
exactly.
here. Shame
Exactly.
if something were to go wrong with it.
But what they're particularly
Right.
doing by the sounds of it is they're buying up little bits and pieces here and there where there's going to be a shortage. So you're Telstra and you're having trouble covering this particular suburb or this particular town. They say, oh, we can help you out. You can rent a bit from us. But over here, they might be renting some to Optus. So they're like the gap filler, and they've just got a little bit here and there to help people out. Are they sure that's going to work as a business model?
Oh, who knows? It's
Has it been
a complete
done
surprise
before?
to
Well, they're
me.
$18 million short. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, but I know that kind of thing's done before. Like we've had when Orange and 3 first started in Australia, Hutchison, whatever the hell they were very metro-centric. And then once you got out of the cities, you would roam onto, I think originally was Telstra, then they did a deal with someone else. So we've had that model before of as you move to a different region, you're still with the same telco, but you roam to a different network. But I'd never heard of anyone talking about doing quite this whole little piecemeal fill in the gaps thing.
But when you consider that an awful lot of the talk around 5G in Australia has been on those business cases, I could imagine that, in fact, they might not even necessarily only be talking to a Telstra or an Optus or a Vodafone or TPG. They might be providing that level of continuity by, again, being the middleman between you and them if you're a large enough business with a 5G use case.
True.
I suppose there's also a business there. Because they have actually said they're not just dealing, if you read the announcements they've made, they're not just carrier-centric. They're not just doing, what NBN does whenever there's a problem. They just say, oh, well, we don't actually deal with end customers. Dentset are actually saying, no, we will deal with end customers. We will deal with carriers. We'll take money from anyone. So I suppose it will come down to how vital the lots they have end up being in specific metropolitan areas. On that point you were making about Toowoomba earlier, Corinne, thinking back on how 4G got rolled out in Australia, the carriers did a lot of regional testing there before they rolled out. But where there was a huge difference was Telstra was 4G in, and this is totally off the top of my head because it's a number of years ago, I think it was about 100, 150 different Australian small regional centres and towns at a point where I think only Optus had launched 4G at all and only in about 3 capital cities. This time around, though, it does look like they're all planning to launch as much regional as they can as soon as they can.
Except for our fourth network, which doesn't look like it's ever going to happen. Corinne, did Vodafone and TPG pull the wool over our eyes here? What's going on? And is the ACCC going to give it their blessing?
So the Vodafone CEO, Iñaki Berroeta, said on Monday when they announced the results of the Spectrum auction that his telco is in the final stages of virtualizing its core network, and it's completed the dark fiber transmission rollout by TPG, which of course was a deal they made around 3 years ago now, I think in 2015, when they made the $1 billion deal together. So they're still waiting to hear back on whether their merger is going to be allowed to proceed, but I have heard that the decision should happen by the end of this week. Iñaki sort of alluded to the fact that he's not really expecting a no, but it might be a maybe in terms of we need more time to think about this or we need more information. So hopefully that happens this week before we all close down for Christmas. But as I said, the ACCC is doing a lot.
They were still, Voda and TPG still put in a joint bid on this spectrum though, didn't they? Even though they're not 100% sure they're going to get together.
Right. So alongside the announcement of their merger back in August, TPG and Vodafone said that they would separately join forces via a joint venture to bid for the 5G spectrum, which was allowed to proceed regardless of whether the merger was approved or not yet.
Okay.
And,
so it's that joint venture that did the
concern.
bidding. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So there was concern from the government that this would bring competition down, but what did you call Rod Sims earlier?
Oh, it's Sim Smash. He gets the big green hands. He gets very excited.
Right, and he argued that the point is not to bring competition down in the spectrum auction because that's not what the government should be worried about, making money. It should be worried about increasing competition in the mobile sector.
Yeah.
So he said that allowing them to bid jointly, sure, it might bring the pricing down in the auction because there's not as many bidders, but it will bring competition up in terms of more players will have more spectrum because they're going to be allowed to keep that spectrum whether or not the merger is approved. So they were allowed to joint bid, and now we're just waiting to see whether they'll be allowed to merge.
I guess the other thing there is in doing that joint bid, it may well speed them along to getting a 5G service up and running, which is more competition. It isn't that fourth network, but Vodafone were notably really slow in getting their 4G network up and running. So maybe we'll see 5G out of them a little bit faster, although Vodafone was notable in that they came out with a statement saying they really weren't happy about how expensive it all was, where Telstra seemed to say, oh, look, we were pretty much happy with how the auction went, and Optus really didn't say anything at all. Do you think it was too expensive for the 5G spectrum?
Well, I mean, I think spectrum is ludicrously expensive, but I think the telcos were definitely expecting it. Sure, Telstra might have a little more money to play with in the Australian market anyway than Vodafone, but I think it's pretty much what everyone expected. Vodafone just likes to get things for a little bit cheaper or shared.
There's a shock.
As we can see through the joint bid. But Yeah, I think Vodafone also made a point of saying, can you please bring the millimeter wave spectrum to auction soon? We need more of that 5G spectrum. And they're the only ones who haven't announced when their 5G network will be launching. Telstra's already launching now. Optus has said January 2019. Vodafone hasn't said yet, but I think that's because they're waiting for the merger decision. Once that is made, they'll be coming out guns blazing, I think, once they combine TPG's fibre backhaul with their small cells.
Is that also, you think, because Voda, PG, TP Voda, whatever we're going to call them, are going to go very metro-centric, and that's why they care so much about that millimetre wave?
Definitely.
I guess the other benefit to launching later is there'll be a much wider range of available devices. Because, Telstra last week showed off the ACCC 5G hub and a prototype ZTE phone that they wouldn't actually commit to launching with. But so far, there really aren't 5G devices. There's a Qualcomm 5G modem out there. But we're probably only a couple of weeks away from seeing some of the first 5G phones, because there's some pretty strong rumours around that a bunch of 5G phones, including possibly the Samsung Galaxy S10, will launch at CES.
But we won't see that here for at least another year, right? The first thing we're going to see is, I think, fixed wireless will be the first 5G consumer implementations.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Corinne, when would you expect to see handsets here on sale? I can walk into a shop and buy one.
Ericsson has predicted, I think it was 6 or 8 5G smartphones by mid-2019, actually. So I think people are rushing, but, no one's going to change their entire mobile plan and buy. I don't even know how expensive a 5G service and a 5G phone will be immediately when they launch in mid-2019. There'll be a lot of issues to iron out, I assume. And there is a bit to be said about Vodafone hanging back and not, spending huge amounts on launching a 5G network when customers aren't going to have 5G smartphones anyway. But hopefully we will see something at CES next month. That would be really cool.
The thing is, I don't think it matters. For those using, Qualcomm's chipset at least, but I would imagine Intel's would be similar. A lot of the smartphone manufacturers will be going, right, well, we've got to put a modem into this device. Do we put the 5G one? Do we put the 4G one? If you put the 5G one and you go, it's the same as if you're roaming internationally and you go somewhere where they've only got 3G coverage. You'll just drop down those scales, but you'll be future-proofed. So I'm left wondering whether or not we might see a lot of 5G capable phones in Australia before the networks are ready for people to actually hook into them. You might be sitting there with something that's a bit speed limited for a while, but ready when it comes, which is probably better than buying something which isn't going to connect a few years down the track to that faster network you want to be connected to.
It's true. And Motorola has already launched the latest Moto has, a clip-on attachment that makes it 5G capable. So I think you're right, and we will see some of those phones that are ready to switch over to the 5G network once it goes live, and then just fall back onto 4G advanced everywhere else.
I actually asked Motorola about the 5G Moto mod that they've got, which is a Verizon one for the States. And they had no plans to release it here because specifically it's actually a millimetre wave mod. It wouldn't work in Australia. You couldn't import one,
yes. You need to make sure that all of these...
Even though the phones and all the rest of it are much the same.
Right.
So they'd have to engineer something for our local conditions, which seems a little unlikely. Although, and like you, I seem to spend my days writing about telcos and similar things. There's a lot of manufacturers out there just starting to talk up 5G, with the exception of Apple. But, Apple never comments on rumour and speculation, as we know. Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thank you to Queen Corinne for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, we love to get your feedback on the show, so feel free to comment to us via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
Thanks everyone for listening, and remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button, tell your friends, ask them to subscribe, leave us a review. It really helps us find new listeners. Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
Adam? Mr. Turner, you there?
Uh-oh.
Okay, Adam has actually dropped out of this recording, which is impressive because
he's
the one running it.
How he let you talk for so long without interrupting.